Sometimes the most confusing behavior from an avoidant person is not what they do, but what they stop doing. They become quiet. They stop initiating conversations. They no longer ask about your day. They may seem almost indifferent, as though the relationship has disappeared from their emotional world. And yet, beneath that silence, there can be a very different psychological process taking place. This is where we have to become careful. Silence does not automatically mean love. Distance does not automatically mean someone is secretly waiting for you. Human behavior is far too complex for that kind of certainty. But when silence is accompanied by subtle signs of continued attention, the picture changes. An avoidant person may withdraw because emotional closeness activates discomfort. For someone who has learned to protect themselves through independence, vulnerability can feel less like intimacy and more like exposure. The closer another person gets, the more intensely they may become aware of their own emotional dependence. And when that awareness becomes uncomfortable, distance becomes a coping strategy. So imagine what happens when you stop reaching out. At first, they may experience relief. The emotional pressure decreases. Nobody is asking them to define the relationship. Nobody is asking them to explain their feelings. Nobody is requiring immediate vulnerability. Their nervous system, so to speak, has more room to breathe. But relief and emotional detachment are not necessarily the same thing. This distinction is crucial. A person can feel relieved by distance while still remaining emotionally invested. They can miss you and still avoid contacting you. They can think about you and still refuse to admit it. They can wonder what you're doing while maintaining the appearance that they don't care. That contradiction is one of the most important things to understand about avoidant behavior. They may not want the intensity of closeness, but they may not actually want the finality of losing the connection either. And this is where subtle behaviors sometimes appear. Perhaps they begin viewing your stories again. Perhaps they become more active around places where they know you might notice them. Maybe they post something that seems strangely connected to your shared history. Maybe they react to something you share after weeks of silence. None of these behaviors individually proves anything. But psychologically, they can represent something important. Continued attention. Why would someone who wants distance continue watching? Because observation is emotionally safer than participation. Watching allows a person to remain connected without becoming vulnerable. They can know what is happening in your life without having to say, "I miss you." They can see whether you've moved on without asking, "Do you still think about me?" They can gather emotional information without risking direct rejection. And this is one reason indirect behavior can become so confusing in relationships. The person who is watching may believe they are doing nothing, but psychologically, observation itself can be a form of attachment. Attention follows emotional significance. We don't continuously monitor what has become completely irrelevant to us. Still, there is an important boundary here. You should never become addicted to interpreting digital traces. A view, a like, a delayed response, or a mysterious post is not the same thing as emotional commitment. If you spend your days analyzing every tiny signal, you have simply exchanged one form of chasing for another. Instead, ask a more meaningful question. What does their overall pattern of behavior tell me? Do they repeatedly create opportunities for connection? Do they become more open when you respond? Do they show genuine curiosity about your life? Do they eventually communicate directly? Most importantly, do their actions become more consistent over time? Because emotional intelligence is not the ability to decode every person perfectly. It is the ability to observe without losing yourself. You don't need to chase someone simply because you suspect they're waiting for you. You don't need to punish them with silence either. You need to become capable of tolerating uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to control your behavior. That is a much deeper form of strength. Sometimes the avoidant is waiting for you to reach out because they are afraid to take the emotional risk themselves. But sometimes they are simply moving on. Your task is not to manufacture a story that makes their silence meaningful. Your task is to watch for evidence. And if you eventually choose to reach out, do it from clarity rather than anxiety. Reach out because you genuinely want a conversation, not because you need reassurance that you are still wanted. Because the moment you stop confusing someone's silence with your responsibility, you reclaim your emotional freedom. Don't chase the signal, watch the pattern, and let consistent action reveal the truth. And once you understand that silence does not necessarily mean emotional detachment, you begin to notice something even more subtle. The avoidant may start testing whether you still care without ever asking the question directly. They rarely walk into the conversation and say, "Do you still have feelings for me?" That kind of question requires vulnerability. It creates the possibility of hearing an answer they don't want. For someone who has learned to protect themselves from emotional exposure, that uncertainty can feel threatening. So instead, they may look for evidence. They watch how you respond. They notice whether you react to something they post. They may become slightly more visible in your world. They might send a casual message that seems almost meaningless, or suddenly respond to something you share after a long period of distance. What they are really trying to discover is something much deeper. Is the emotional door still open? And this is where human psychology becomes fascinating. We often want reassurance without wanting to expose the fact that we need reassurance. The avoidant person can experience exactly this contradiction. They may want to know that you still care, while simultaneously resisting the vulnerability required to ask. So they test the environment. Think of it as emotional risk management. Instead of taking a direct emotional risk, "I miss you," they take a smaller behavioral risk. "Let me see how they respond if I appear." If you respond warmly, they receive information. If you ignore them, they can retreat without having explicitly confessed anything. This gives them something psychologically valuable, plausible deniability. If the interaction goes badly, they can tell themselves it didn't matter. If the interaction goes well, they have evidence that connection may still be possible. But there is another layer here. Sometimes the test isn't designed consciously. The person may not be sitting somewhere thinking, "I'm going to manipulate this situation and see whether they chase me." Human behavior is often much less deliberate than that. A person can act from an emotional pattern without fully understanding the pattern themselves. They may feel lonely, become curious, check your profile, notice something about your life, and suddenly feel the urge to reconnect. Then their protective instincts appear, and instead of saying what they actually feel, they send something casual. This is why interpreting avoidant behavior requires nuance. You don't want to turn every indirect behavior into a psychological diagnosis. You want to understand the possibility behind it while remaining grounded in observable reality. Ask yourself, what happens when I don't chase? If you stop initiating and they begin making small efforts to regain contact, that may tell you something. If they repeatedly create openings for communication, that tells you more. If they eventually become capable of having a direct conversation about what happened, that tells you even more. The progression matters. One small signal is ambiguous. A consistent pattern is information. And eventually, healthy connection requires more than information. It requires courage. This is where many people become trapped. They become so focused on decoding the avoidant that they forget to evaluate the relationship itself. They spend hours wondering what a message meant, why a person viewed their story, why they suddenly became active, why they disappeared again. But emotional intelligence asks a different question. Is this relationship becoming healthier? That's the question that changes everything. Because you can understand why someone behaves the way they do and still decide that their behavior isn't acceptable for you. Understanding is not the same as excusing. Compassion is not the same as self-abandonment. And psychological insight should never become an excuse for tolerating indefinite uncertainty. If someone is testing whether you still care, you don't have to prove your love by chasing them. You can respond honestly when communication becomes direct. You can remain open without becoming available to confusion. You can care about someone while maintaining boundaries around how you expect to be treated. There is tremendous emotional maturity in that position. You are essentially saying, "I don't need to punish you for being afraid, but I also won't organize my life around your fear." That is what secure behavior looks like. You stop trying to force another person into emotional readiness. You allow their actions to reveal their capacity. And sometimes, when you stop supplying all the emotional energy, the other person finally becomes aware of the space you were filling. They notice your absence. They notice that you're no longer constantly available. They notice that the relationship cannot survive indefinitely on one person's effort. That realization can create curiosity. Curiosity can create contact. Contact can create an opportunity for honesty, but the opportunity is not the outcome. The outcome depends on what they do next. Because the real sign that someone wants you isn't simply that they test whether you still care. The real sign is that, eventually, they become willing to show that they care too. So if an avoidant begins testing the emotional waters, don't rush to prove yourself. Don't panic. Don't perform. Observe. Give them room to reveal what they are capable of, because the healthiest relationships aren't built on one person constantly interpreting the other's silence. They're built when both people eventually become brave enough to speak. Don't prove your worth by chasing their uncertainty. Let their willingness to show up become the evidence. Asterisk. And once you've learned to recognize the difference between genuine emotional movement and simple curiosity, there is another behavior worth paying attention to. Sometimes an avoidant person doesn't come back with a dramatic confession. They don't suddenly tell you that they've been thinking about you every night. Instead, they find a reason to reappear, and often, that reason seems almost insignificant. They may ask a question they could easily answer themselves. They may send you something that reminds them of an old conversation. They may suddenly mention an inside joke. They might ask how you're doing, comment on something you posted, or bring up a practical matter that technically didn't require contacting you at all. On the surface, it looks casual. Psychologically, however, the significance may be that they have created an opening. For someone uncomfortable with vulnerability, an opening can feel much safer than a confession. Saying "I miss you" exposes the emotional truth immediately, but saying "Hey, do you remember that place we went?" allows the same person to approach the emotional territory without fully revealing why they're there. This is an important distinction. People don't always approach emotional experiences directly. Sometimes they approach them indirectly, through memory, curiosity, humor, practical questions, or seemingly random contact. Why? Because the indirect route reduces perceived emotional risk. Imagine someone standing outside a door they desperately want to enter, but are afraid to knock on. They might walk past it several times. They might look through the window. They might touch the handle. Eventually, they may knock very softly. That doesn't guarantee they are ready to walk inside, but it does tell you that they are no longer completely committed to staying outside. This is often what reappearance looks like with an emotionally guarded person. The mistake is to immediately interpret the message as proof that they want a relationship again. That's too simplistic. Reaching out can mean many things. They could be lonely. They could be nostalgic. They could be curious. They could miss your presence. They could want reassurance. Or they could genuinely be reconsidering the relationship. The message itself doesn't tell you which one it is. The pattern after the message does. This is where emotional intelligence becomes practical. Instead of asking, "What does this text secretly mean?" ask, "What happens after I respond?" Do they continue the conversation? Do they ask meaningful questions? Do they show interest in your life? Do they acknowledge what happened between you? Do they make another effort later? Do they become more emotionally available? Or do they send one message, receive reassurance, and disappear again? Those outcomes are psychologically very different. The first may indicate movement toward connection. The second may indicate that they were seeking temporary emotional regulation. And this distinction matters because sometimes people return not because they are ready to build something, but because they miss how you made them feel. That can be painful to recognize. Someone can miss your attention without being prepared to offer consistency. They can miss your warmth without being prepared to reciprocate it. They can want access to you without being ready for the responsibilities of intimacy. So don't measure someone's intentions only by whether they return. Measure them by asterisk what they do after returning, asterisk. That is one of the most important principles you can carry into any relationship. Because returning is easy, staying present is harder, starting a conversation is easy, having an uncomfortable conversation is harder. Saying "I miss you" is easy compared with saying "I understand how my behavior affected you, and I'm willing to change it." The deeper question isn't whether they can cross the distance once, it's whether they can tolerate closeness without immediately creating another distance. This is where attachment patterns become especially important. An avoidant person may genuinely desire intimacy and simultaneously fear the vulnerability that intimacy demands. When closeness increases, their defenses may become activated. When distance increases, their longing may become more noticeable. That creates a cycle. Distance creates safety. Safety creates longing. Longing creates approach. Approach creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates discomfort. Discomfort creates distance again. If you don't understand this cycle, you may spend years interpreting each return as evidence that the relationship has finally changed. But returning isn't necessarily transformation. Transformation requires a new pattern, and that's where your role changes. You don't have to become a detective. You don't have to decode every sentence. You don't have to convince them that you are safe enough to love. You simply have to become an accurate observer. If they reach out, respond according to what feels healthy for you. Don't punish them, but don't overinvest immediately either. Allow the interaction to develop naturally. Let consistency reveal intention. If they want genuine connection, give them the opportunity to demonstrate it. If they only wanted temporary reassurance, their behavior will eventually reveal that too. And remember something else. You don't have to make their emotional journey your responsibility. You can understand why someone struggles with intimacy and still require them to take responsibility for how that struggle affects you. That's not cruelty. That's emotional maturity. A healthy relationship doesn't require one person to become the therapist, translator, rescuer, and emotional manager of the other. Both people have to participate. So when an avoidant finds a reason to reappear, don't immediately ask, does this mean they want me back? Ask a more powerful question. What are they willing to do now that they have come back? Asterisk. Because that question shifts your attention away from fantasy and toward evidence, and evidence is where emotional clarity begins. Don't be impressed by their return. Watch what they do with the opportunity to stay. Asterisk. And once you begin paying attention not simply to whether an avoidant person returns, but to what they do after returning, another subtle shift becomes important. Their emotional distance may stop looking stable. The coldness that once seemed absolute begins to fluctuate. One day, they appear completely detached. The next, they seem unusually interested. They may respond warmly, then become distant again. They may disappear for a while, and then suddenly become visible. They may act as though nothing matters, and then reveal a moment of sensitivity that suggests far more is happening underneath. This inconsistency can be confusing, but psychologically, inconsistency sometimes reflects an internal conflict rather than a lack of feeling. Consider what happens when two competing needs exist inside the same person. One part of them wants connection, another part wants protection. One part wants to move closer. Another part becomes alarmed by what closeness might require. The result is an emotional tug-of-war. And the person standing on the other side of that tug-of-war experiences it as mixed signals. This is why an avoidant person's behavior can sometimes seem contradictory. When they are far away, they may begin missing the connection. When they move closer, vulnerability becomes more noticeable. When vulnerability becomes uncomfortable, they create distance again. Then, after enough distance, the emotional attachment may become noticeable once more. The cycle can repeat. But here's something important. Understanding the cycle doesn't mean you should tolerate endless instability. Psychological insight is useful only when it helps you make better decisions. You can understand that someone is afraid of intimacy and still say, I need consistency. You can recognize that someone has difficulty expressing emotion and still expect respectful communication. You can have compassion for someone's defenses without allowing those defenses to repeatedly injure you. That distinction is essential, because sometimes people confuse empathy with endurance. They think, if I understand why they behave this way, I should keep accepting it. No. Understanding explains behavior. It does not automatically justify behavior, and this is where emotional intelligence becomes more sophisticated than simply being sensitive to another person's feelings. Emotional intelligence also requires awareness of your own internal state. How does their inconsistency affect you? Do you feel calm when you're with them? Or are you constantly waiting for the next withdrawal? Do you feel valued? Or do you feel as though you're continually auditioning for their attention? Do you experience genuine connection? Or are you spending most of your energy interpreting what their behavior might mean? These questions matter because relationships are not only about what the other person feels, they are also about what the relationship does to your psychological well-being. An avoidant may genuinely care about you and still be incapable, at this moment, of maintaining a healthy relationship. Both things can be true. That's one of the hardest truths to accept. We often want emotional logic to be simple. If someone loves us, we assume they will act lovingly. If they miss us, we assume they will reach out. If they fear losing us, we assume they will fight to keep us. But human beings don't always behave according to what they feel. People behave according to what they feel, asterisk, asterisk, and asterisk, asterisk, what they know, what they fear, what they have learned, and what they are capable of tolerating. Someone can have strong feelings and weak relational skills. Someone can want intimacy and fear vulnerability. Someone can miss you and still run from you. That is why feelings alone are not enough. What matters is whether feelings eventually become responsible action. You may notice an avoidant becoming softer. Maybe they begin asking more questions. Maybe their communication becomes warmer. Maybe they show a little more curiosity about your life. Maybe they stop pretending that the relationship never mattered. Those can be meaningful signs, but don't rush to complete the story for them. Let them complete it through their behavior. If they are genuinely moving toward connection, you won't have to manufacture every opportunity. They will eventually contribute. They will initiate. They will communicate. They will tolerate uncomfortable conversations. They will demonstrate that closeness doesn't automatically mean losing themselves. And if they aren't ready, their inconsistency will eventually reveal that too. This is why your greatest power is not in controlling the distance between you. It is in refusing to lose your center while that distance changes. When they come closer, don't immediately abandon your boundaries. When they pull away, don't immediately assume you've been rejected. When they become warm, appreciate it without turning one warm interaction into a promise about the future. Stay present, observe, let time reveal the pattern. Because emotional maturity means resisting the temptation to make permanent conclusions from temporary behavior. A single affectionate message doesn't prove transformation. A single withdrawal doesn't prove indifference. The truth exists in the pattern that unfolds over time. And perhaps this is one of the most important lessons in relationships. You don't need to force certainty where certainty has not yet been earned. You can remain open while remaining grounded. You can care without chasing. You can understand without excusing. And you can give someone room to grow without putting your own life on hold while they decide whether they are ready. So if you notice an avoidant becoming less consistently distant, don't rush toward them simply because the door appears to be opening. Stand where you are. Let them walk toward you. Let their consistency tell you whether the opening is real. Because the goal isn't simply to get someone back. The goal is to create a relationship where neither person has to keep running to feel safe. Don't confuse emotional fluctuation with emotional growth. Real change is not a moment of warmth. It is a pattern of consistency. Asterisk, asterisk. And this brings us to another subtle shift that often becomes visible when you stop chasing an avoidant person. They may suddenly become more curious about your life. At first, this can seem strange. When you were constantly available, they may have appeared comfortable with the distance. They knew you were there. They knew you would probably respond. They knew the emotional connection was still accessible. Then you stop, and something changes. Your absence creates uncertainty. Psychologically, uncertainty can make us pay attention to things we previously took for granted. When something is always available, the mind can become accustomed to its presence. We don't necessarily stop caring. We simply stop noticing the significance of what is consistently there. Then the pattern changes. Suddenly, the person who once assumed your availability has to wonder, what are you doing now? Are you still thinking about them? Have you emotionally moved forward? Are you becoming happier without them? Has someone else entered your life? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, asterisk, asterisk, what if they no longer have access to the version of you that was always waiting? Asterisk, asterisk. That question can awaken awareness. But again, we need to be careful. Curiosity is not the same as commitment. Jealousy is not the same as love. Missing your attention is not the same as being prepared for intimacy. The important thing is not that they become curious. The important thing is what that curiosity leads them to do. This is where your behavior matters too. If you stop chasing, don't do it as a strategy designed to provoke them. Don't disappear simply to make them anxious. Don't post things designed to create jealousy. Don't manufacture a new life on social media just to make someone wonder what they're missing. That is still emotional dependence. You are still organizing your behavior around their reaction. The deeper goal is different. You stop chasing because you are returning your attention to yourself. You begin living your life because your life deserves your attention, whether they return or not. And something psychologically powerful happens when you make that shift. Your emotional center moves from "what are they doing?" to "what am I doing with my life?" That is not just a relationship strategy, it is personal development. When someone has become emotionally preoccupied with an unavailable person, their attention can become externally anchored. Their mood depends on a message. Their confidence depends on whether someone watches their story. Their sense of hope rises when the other person appears and collapses when they disappear. That is an exhausting way to live. The healthier alternative is to reclaim your attention. Work, friendships, learning, creativity, health, purpose, silence. The ordinary parts of life that remind you that your identity is larger than one relationship. And ironically, that is often when an avoidant person may notice you differently, not because you're playing hard to get, but because you're no longer emotionally orbiting them. There is a profound difference between being unavailable and being self-directed. Being unavailable says, "I want you to feel my absence." Being self-directed says, "I have a life to live whether you notice or not." That second position is much more powerful. It also creates a healthier foundation if they eventually return, because if they come back and discover that you have spent the entire period waiting, nothing fundamental has changed. The emotional dependency remains. The relationship can easily return to the same cycle. But if they return and discover that you've developed greater emotional stability, stronger boundaries, and a clearer sense of yourself, the dynamic is different. You're no longer asking them to complete your emotional world. You're inviting them to participate in it. That distinction changes everything, and this is why curiosity can sometimes become a meaningful sign. If they begin asking about your life after you've stopped chasing, pay attention to whether their interest develops into genuine engagement. Do they ask follow-up questions? Do they remember details? Do they initiate again? Do they want to understand how you've changed? Do they show vulnerability? Do they make an effort to rebuild trust? These behaviors tell you far more than a single view, like, or casual message. Because curiosity without action eventually becomes another form of distance, and you don't need to chase someone into becoming curious about you. You certainly don't need to compete for their attention. Your responsibility is to become so grounded in your own life that their attention becomes a choice rather than a necessity. There is also something philosophically important here. Sometimes we think another person's absence determines our value. If they don't choose us, we conclude that we weren't enough. But another person's capacity to connect is not a reliable measurement of your worth. Someone's emotional limitations don't define your emotional value. Their avoidance doesn't prove you're unlovable. Their confusion doesn't mean you need to become more impressive, more attractive, more patient, or more available. You don't have to earn basic reciprocity. So if an avoidant begins showing more curiosity after you stop chasing, don't rush to interpret it as a promise. Receive the information, stay grounded, let them demonstrate what that curiosity means, and meanwhile keep moving. Because the healthiest form of no contact isn't about making someone miss you. It's about remembering yourself. Stop living to be noticed by someone else. Build a life so meaningful that their attention becomes a bonus, not your proof of worth. And now we arrive at perhaps the most important part of this entire pattern. An avoidant person may become more curious about your life. They may test whether you still care. They may find a reason to return. Their emotional distance may begin to fluctuate. But eventually, there has to be something more meaningful than signals. There has to be an opening. And sometimes that opening is surprisingly small. They may respond to something you post. They may send a simple message. They may ask a question that doesn't really require an answer. They may mention an old memory. They may suddenly become warmer when you speak. They may create an opportunity where you could easily continue the conversation, and then they wait. This is where many people make a mistake. They see the opening and immediately rush through it emotionally. They interpret one small gesture as proof that everything has changed. They start explaining their feelings, asking where the relationship is going, demanding clarity, or trying to recover months of lost emotional connection in a single conversation. But emotional reconnection doesn't usually work that way. When someone has a strong protective response to intimacy, too much emotional intensity too quickly can cause the very withdrawal you're hoping to prevent. So if an opening appears, don't overwhelm it. Let it breathe. Think about what you're actually trying to accomplish. You're not trying to force a confession. You're not trying to extract reassurance. You're trying to discover whether two people can communicate differently than they did before. That requires patience. If they reach out, respond naturally. If they ask a question, answer it. If they show interest, allow the conversation to develop. You don't need to immediately expose every emotion you've been carrying. Why? Because emotional safety is built through repeated experiences. One conversation doesn't create trust. One apology doesn't repair everything. One affectionate moment doesn't establish a healthy relationship. Trust develops when someone's nervous system repeatedly learns that closeness does not automatically lead to danger, rejection, humiliation, control, or emotional chaos. But, and this is equally important, you cannot build that safety alone. The avoidant person has to participate. They have to learn to communicate. They have to tolerate discomfort. They have to take responsibility for their actions. They have to become increasingly capable of staying present when emotions become difficult. Otherwise, you are simply adapting yourself around their avoidance. And that is not intimacy. That is accommodation. There is a profound difference between giving someone space and making yourself smaller so they never feel uncomfortable. Healthy space says, you are allowed to move at a human pace. Unhealthy accommodation says, I will accept anything as long as you don't leave. You need to know which one you're practicing. This is why the final sign is not merely that the avoidant gives you an opening. The deeper sign is whether they eventually take responsibility for the connection that follows. Do they continue communicating? Do they initiate sometimes? Do they become more emotionally transparent? Do they acknowledge the impact of their withdrawal? Do they demonstrate consistency when things become uncomfortable? Do they show that they aren't simply waiting for you to carry the relationship again? These questions matter because there is a dangerous illusion in emotionally complicated relationships. The belief that getting someone to come back is the ultimate victory. It isn't. Getting someone back is easy compared with building something healthier together. Someone can return because they're lonely. They can return because they miss your attention. They can return because they're afraid you've moved on. They can return because they want reassurance. But none of those reasons automatically means they're ready to create a stable relationship. Readiness is demonstrated through behavior, and this is where you need to protect yourself from becoming addicted to potential. Potential is seductive. You can imagine who someone could become. You can remember the good moments. You can explain their difficult behavior through their past. You can tell yourself that underneath the avoidance is someone who deeply loves you. Maybe there is, but relationships are not built on what exists underneath someone's behavior. They are built on what someone consistently brings into the relationship. That is the standard. Not perfection, not constant availability, not flawless communication. Consistency, effort, honesty, repair, reciprocity. If an avoidant gives you an opening, you don't have to reject it out of pride. But you also don't have to abandon your standards out of hope. You can meet them halfway. Let them walk the other half. And if they stop walking, you have your answer. That is emotional maturity. You don't force someone to choose you. You don't manipulate someone into missing you. You don't spend months decoding silence. You create enough emotional space for another person to reveal themselves. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing more complicated than refusing to chase the uncertainty. If they genuinely want to reconnect, they will eventually need to become more direct. They will need to move from hints to communication, from curiosity to effort, from emotional testing to emotional honesty, from returning occasionally to actually staying. That is the transition you should be watching for. Because love is not ultimately proven by how intensely someone feels when they are afraid of losing you. It is proven by what they are willing to do when they have the opportunity to keep you. So if the avoidant gives you that opening, don't panic. Don't rush. Don't perform. Don't try to become irresistible. Simply stay grounded and observe. Give them the dignity of making their own choice, and give yourself the dignity of believing what their consistent actions tell you. Because you deserve more than someone who secretly wants you, but continually avoids showing it. You deserve a relationship where love does not have to hide behind silence. Asterisk. An opening is not a promise. Let consistent effort turn the possibility of love into evidence. Asterisk.